The first truckload of grape skins arrived at Annalise Drummond's property in Yamhill County, Oregon, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in October. And by the time the last truck finished dumping that week, 800 tons of spent pomace sat steaming gently in a low field behind her barn. Skins and seeds and stems pressed dry of their juice and considered by the winery that produced them to be waste, requiring the fastest and cheapest disposal it could arrange, a problem to be solved rather than a material worth a second look. Thistlewood Cellars, the operation 2 roads over that had been crushing grapes in that valley for 11 years and had built a modest regional reputation for its Pinot, needed somewhere to put the byproduct every harvest produced by the ton. And Annalise owned 40 low acres. Nobody was farming that particular fall. Ground that had sat fallow since her divorce 2 years earlier had left her holding a piece of land she had never quite decided what to do with. The kind of property that exists mostly as a line item on a settlement, rather than a real plan for a life she still felt entirely certain about. The winery's manager offered her a modest fee to take it. She said yes, without thinking too hard about the number. The way a person says yes to something that seems easy to reverse if it turns out to be a mistake. Mostly because it was the first offer that had come her way in months that involved any money changing hands in her direction at all. It was not, by any measure, an obviously good idea. Fresh grape pomace is wet, heavy, and highly perishable, mold setting in within days if the pile is not managed properly, and a field full of it steaming under a gray Oregon sky struck most of her neighbors as exactly the kind of arrangement that ends in a fine from the county for improper waste disposal, not the beginning of anything worth building. A fact more than one of them mentioned to her directly over that first uncertain week, leaning on her fence with an expression that suggested they were being kind by warning her at all. Annalise had 2 failed attempts of her own before she found the third approach that actually worked. Both earlier ones well-intentioned, both of them expensive lessons about a material she had badly underestimated the first time she looked at it steaming in her own field, and assumed it would behave the way her grandmother's small kitchen batches always had. 4 years later, a small line of skincare products made from that same pomace, extracted and formulated on her own property in a converted section of the barn that had once stored nothing but old farm equipment, was selling out at boutique spas and specialty retailers across 3 states, priced well above what most people expect to pay for a jar of face cream. And Thistlewood Cellars had gone from paying her to take its waste to competing with 2 other regional wineries for the right to sell her their skins first, an arrangement nobody involved could have predicted the year that first truckload rolled up her lane. If stories about overlooked material, quiet persistence, and real value built out of what everybody else considered garbage mean something to you, subscribe and join our farming family. And tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, wherever that happens to be. We would love to know how far this story has traveled. Yamhill County sits in the heart of the Willamette Valley, one of the country's most respected wine-growing regions. Rolling hills of vineyards stretching in every direction, and a wine industry that produces, every single autumn, an enormous quantity of pomace that most operations treat purely as a disposal problem to be solved as cheaply and quickly as possible. Hauled to compost operations or spread thin on fields where it mostly just breaks down and disappears into the soil without anyone extracting a single thing of value from it first. What gets thrown away in that process is, chemically speaking, remarkably valuable. A fact almost nobody in the wine business had any real reason to think about, given how differently the 2 industries measure success. Grape skins carry a dense concentration of polyphenols, the same compounds responsible for a red wine's color and much of its flavor complexity. And among those polyphenols are powerful antioxidants prized in skincare for their ability to neutralize the free radicals that damage skin cells over time, and accelerate visible aging. Compounds that cosmetic chemists elsewhere had already spent years studying in isolated, laboratory-produced form, long before anyone thought to look at a winery's own discarded skins as a source. Grape seeds, meanwhile, yield an oil rich in linoleic acid and natural vitamin E, both of which help support the skin's own barrier function and hold moisture in a way many synthetic ingredients cannot match as effectively. A quiet piece of chemistry sitting inside every ton of pomace that most wineries never think about twice. None of that is a new discovery. Anneliese found the first real evidence of it, not in a scientific paper, but in a water-damaged recipe notebook that had belonged to her grandmother Perpetua, a woman trained as an esthetician in pre-war Europe, who had immigrated with nothing but her hands, her training, and a habit of writing down every formula she ever mixed for a client. Carrying that single habit across an ocean, and through 2 languages, and a whole new life. Entries in a small, careful slanted script that Anneliese had to hold up to a window some evenings, just to make out clearly. Perpetua had made small batches of grape-based salves and creams for decades, using whatever she could source locally. Oils pressed at home, skins dried on a windowsill, working at a scale that never once approached anything close to industrial, because industrial quantities of fresh pomace had simply never been available to a woman working out of a rented kitchen in a small American city with no connections to the wine trade at all. Anneliese inherited that notebook when her grandmother died, and it sat in a drawer for nearly a decade, moved from one apartment to the next, through a marriage and eventually a difficult divorce, without ever once being opened for more than a passing glance, before 800 tons of exactly the raw material Perpetua had always worked in scarcity suddenly showed up steaming in a field behind her own barn. A coincidence so strange that Anneliese later admitted she assumed, for the first few days, that she was imagining the connection entirely. Here is the mechanism, and it is the whole reason a woman with no cosmetic chemistry background eventually built something a regional wine industry had spent a century simply hauling to the dump. Extracting the valuable compounds from pomace without destroying them requires real care. The polyphenols that make grape skin extracts so prized in skincare are delicate, breaking down under excess heat, prolonged air exposure, or improper pH, which means a producer cannot simply cook the material the way one might reduce a fruit for jam, a shortcut that would destroy the very thing making the extract worth anything in the first place. Cold extraction methods, carefully controlled temperature and timing, preserve far more of the antioxidant activity than a fast, hot process would. And the seed oil requires its own separate cold press, done quickly after the pomace is separated from the rest of the material, because oil left sitting in decomposing plant material degrades within days into something closer to rancid than useful, a window of usability measured in a matter of days rather than weeks. Perpetua's notebook had the proportions and the sequence roughly right, worked out decades earlier through nothing but patient trial with small quantities, a few pounds of skins at a time processed carefully by hand in a home kitchen, with no equipment beyond what any careful cook might already own. What it did not have, and what Anneliese had to learn entirely on her own, was how to manage that same process at a scale measured in tons rather than teaspoons, without losing the delicate compounds the whole business depended on. A gap between a home recipe and a functioning production line that turned out to be far wider than either of them could have guessed from the page alone. Her first attempt failed because she tried to dry too much pomace too slowly in the open field, the way Perpetua's notes described drying small amounts on a windowsill, a method that had worked fine for a few pounds spread out in gentle sunlight, but that simply could not keep pace with 800 tons sitting wet and dense in a field through a damp Oregon autumn, and mold took hold across nearly a third of the pile before she could process any of it. An entire truckload lost to rot within a week of arrival, the smell alone enough to draw a concerned call from a neighbor half a mile down the road. Her second attempt failed differently, and in some ways more discouragingly, because it looked at first like real progress. She built a small extraction setup indoors and pushed the temperature too high, trying to speed the process along on a tight timeline, reasoning that a little more heat would simply mean a faster batch with no real cost attached. And an entire batch of what should have been potent, antioxidant-rich extract came out of the equipment essentially inert, chemically present, but stripped of the very activity that made it worth anything at all. A result she only understood fully once she sent a sample out for lab testing and got the numbers back weeks later. Delphine Auclair, an established formulator who ran a well-respected natural skincare line 2 counties over, had heard about the Pomacy operation through a mutual supplier and driven out, expecting, by her own later admission, to find either a serious competitor worth worrying about or an amateur about to poison herself with improperly processed plant matter. Having seen enough well-meaning hobbyists ruin good raw material over the years to feel fairly confident she already knew which one she was about to meet. She found neither, exactly. She found a woman making careful, expensive mistakes in the right general direction, methodical about her failures in a way Delphine recognized from her own early years in the business. And something about that combination, more than any particular product Annalise showed her that first visit, convinced Delphine to stay longer than she had planned and help rather than simply leave with a polite excuse about a meeting back in town. The catastrophe came the year Annalise finally scaled up for a real launch. Contracted with a distributor she had spent the better part of a year courting, and pushed a full production run through her improved process just weeks before the product was due on retail shelves. Months of careful, hard-won progress, finally converging on a single real deadline for the first time. A refrigeration failure in the storage unit, holding several tons of dry, extracted material, went unnoticed over a long holiday weekend. A faulty compressor that gave no warning before it simply stopped. And by the time anyone caught it, heat and humidity had compromised the entire batch. Months of processing and nearly the whole season's supply of finished extract rendered unusable, just as contracts and shipping dates had already been signed and printed on paper that suddenly represented promises she was not sure she could keep. It was, by any reasonable measure, close to catastrophic, threatening to cost her the distributor relationship entirely and the capital she had put into the launch before a single jar had reached a single shelf. A loss that in dollar terms alone would have set the whole operation back by years. Delphine did not let her panic alone, showing up the same evening she got the phone call rather than waiting for morning. The two of them spent a brutal stretch of nights reworking the production schedule, sourcing a smaller emergency batch of fresh pomace from Thistlewood out of season through a favor Delphine called in from a contact of her own, and rebuilding enough usable extract to meet a scaled-down version of the original order, late but intact, apologizing to the distributor honestly, rather than pretending nothing had gone wrong and hoping the gap would go unnoticed. What followed was not a dramatic reveal so much as a pattern that took months to notice as a pattern at all. No press release moved the business forward. No single review or celebrity mention changed anything overnight. And Annalise had, if she was honest, spent that first year half expecting some single loud moment to arrive and validate the whole project in one clean stroke, the way it seemed to happen for other small brands she read about. Spas that ordered once simply ordered again, then increased the order the third time without ever explaining why. A boutique retailer in Portland that had taken the line on a trial basis quietly moved it to a permanent shelf without ever announcing anything about it. The product simply staying in the case season after season while others around it rotated out. The silence itself, order after steady order arriving with no fanfare attached, no phone call, no write-up, nothing to point to and call proof, was the only evidence Annalise ever really got that the thing had worked, and it took her the better part of a year to trust that the pattern was not going to reverse itself the way her first two attempts had. It never spread into a wider local movement the way some ideas do. Other winery-adjacent landowners in that valley heard about Annalise's business, several of them holding on to their own low, unused acreage next to a productive vineyard, and wondering privately whether they were sitting on the same opportunity. And a few made polite inquiries about how she had gotten started. But the regulatory path alone, cosmetic labeling requirements, safety testing, manufacturing standards that a kitchen operation could never satisfy without significant investment, and a formulator willing to stake her own reputation on the process, discouraged nearly everyone who looked closely at what it would actually take to follow her. Most who inquired went no further than a single conversation, thanked her for her time, and went back to leasing their spare ground out for hay, or simply leaving it follow the way it had always been. Annalise remained, years later, the only operation in that stretch of the Willamette Valley turning winery waste into a finished cosmetic product rather than simply composting it or hauling it away. A fact that surprised her more than it should have, given how much work it had taken to get there, and how openly she had always been willing to describe the process to anyone who genuinely asked. She keeps her grandmother's old notebook in the very same drawer it always lived in, though it comes out now on a fairly regular basis, because her niece, who apprenticed under Delphine for 2 years before coming to work alongside Annalise full-time, learning the same delicate extraction process the hard way that her aunt once had, asked to see it often enough that Annalise finally just handed it to her outright one afternoon, water stains and all, telling her that a recipe only stays alive if somebody younger keeps opening the same drawer, instead of leaving it to sit for another decade, the way Annalise herself once had. Have you ever built something real and lasting out of a mess nobody else wanted to touch in the first place? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe and let us know where you are watching from tonight.